Hey, how's it going? I'm Jeffrey, and this is AutoAlchemy, and this is video 4 in my series where I'm reading through Psychological Types by Carl Jung, and I'm just going to jump into it with the problem of transubstantiation. So, for those who don't know, transubstantiation is basically this idea that during Catholic Mass, the bread and wine literally become the body and blood of Jesus. There is some, I can already anticipate what this chapter is going to be about based on previous chapters where we've talked about how certain people have a tendency to view things more materialistically and certain people have a tendency to view things more abstractly and perhaps spiritually. So I think that's where we're going to start to see this tension of typology in this section. So, with the immense political upheavals of that age, the collapse of the Roman Empire, and the decay of ancient civilization, these controversies likewise passed into oblivion. By these controversies, we are talking about other controversies, other splits and heresies in the church. But when, after several centuries, a state of stability was again reached, the psychological differences also reappeared in their characteristic ways, tentatively at first, but becoming ever more intense with advancing civilization. No longer was it the problems that had thrown the early church into an uproar, new forms had been devised, but underneath them the same psychology was revealed. This really gets at that idea of the archetypes, and I think of it almost as an archetypal wheel. History keeps moving, but we encounter very similar situations and events and dramas on the world stage. They just happen to be in different costumes, different attire. And once you have that schema in mind, you can start to hypothesize about where we might be in certain archetypal dramas and where we might be headed. Man, this book is really testing me as far as pronunciations. About the middle of the 9th century, the abbot P.R. appeared on the scene with a treatise on the communion, in which he propounded the doctrine of the transubstantiation, the assertion that the wine and holy water become transformed into the actual blood and body of Christ. As is well known, this view became a dogma, according to which the transformation is accomplished in truth and reality in substance. Although the accidentals, the bread and wine, preserve their outer aspect, they are substantially the flesh and blood of Christ. Again, this extreme concretization of a symbol Ratramnus, a monk of the same monastery where Radbertus was abbot, ventured to raise some opposition. So, like I said, this is the idea that the wine and, I said water earlier, wine and wafer become transformed into the actual blood and body. They maintain a superficial appearance, but in some sense they become the lifeblood, the substance which perpetuates the existence of Jesus. I think it makes sense in an abstract way because participating in the ritual and having that intentionality that you're bringing to this liturgical act, you therefore extend, in some sense, the intentionality and agency of this guy who existed 2,000 years ago, not to be too sacrilegious. And so, in that sense, you give material and give blood to him. I don't know. But then I also see why people want to oppose that as being a little too literal. However, Radbertus found a more resolute opponent in Scotus Erigena, one of the great philosophers and daring thinkers of the Middle Ages, who, as Hayes says in his History of the Christian Church, towered so high and solitary above his time that his doctrines were not sufficiently understood to be condemned by the church until the 13th century. So this guy was ahead of his time. As abbot of Malmesbury, he was butchered by his own monks about the year 889. Wow. Scotus Erigena, I'm probably going to say his name differently each time I say it. Scotus Erigena, for whom true philosophy was also true religion, was no blind follower of authority and the once accepted, because unlike the majority of his age, he himself could think. This harkens back a bit to previous chapters where we've talked about subject versus object, introversion versus extroversion. Typically, when Jung talks about dogma and authority, he's thinking about people who are being informed extrovertedly. And this guy is perhaps an introverted thinker who can contend with the ideas on his own. He set reason above authority, very unseasonably perhaps, but in a way that assured him the acclaim of later centuries. That's all one can hope for, man. Get dissected by the masses and the mob and have your vindication through history. Even the church fathers, who were considered to be above discussion, he held as authorities only insofar as the treasures of human reason were contained in their writings. Thus, he also held that the communion was nothing more than a commemoration of that Last Supper which Jesus celebrated with his disciples, a view in which all reasonable men in every age will occur. Scotus Erigena, clear and humanistic as he was in his thinking, and however little disposed to detract from the significance and value of the sacred ceremony, was not attuned to the spirit of his age and the desires of the world around him, a fact that might indeed be inferred from his assassination by his own comrades of the cloister. Because he could think rationally and logically, success did not come to him. Success did not come to him. Instead, it fell to Radbertus, who assuredly could not think, but who transubstantiated the symbolic and meaningful, and made it coarse and sensual, attuned as he obviously was to the spirit of his age, which was all for the concretization of religious experiences. So Radbertus wanted to say that this transubstantiation was an actual transformation of material, a literal, concrete transformation, whereas his opponent here, one of his opponents here, Scotus Erigena, really thought that it was just a symbolic way of honoring and commemorating a historical experience. Again, we have some oppositions being pitted against one another. Scotus Erigena actually had an appreciation for the symbolic and meaningful and didn't need it to be literal. And apparently, you could speculate that he died from it. Again, in this controversy, we can easily recognize the basic elements we have already met in the disputes discussed earlier. The abstract standpoint that abhors any contamination with the concrete object, and the concretistic that is turned towards the object. So this is also somewhat introverted, right? Because we're talking about the object. We don't want to be contaminated with the object. And then something that's very literal and concrete being turned towards the object. Far be it from us to pronounce, from the intellectual standpoint, a one-sided depreciatory judgment on Radbertus and his achievement. Although to the modern mind this dogma must appear simply absurd, we should not be misled on that account into declaring it historically worthless. I think that's a bit of a strong statement, because I think that there are people who would stand by that interpretation of the taking of communion even today. Certainly, it is a showpiece for every collection of human aberrations, but that does not establish its worthlessness Eo ipso? What does that mean?
Eo ipso.
Eo ipso. Does not establish its worthlessness thereby. Okay, a worthless logical connector. Before passing judgment, we must carefully examine what this dogma accomplished in the religious life of that epoch and what our age still owes indirectly to its effect. It must not be overlooked, for instance, that it is precisely the belief in the reality of this miracle that demands a detachment of the psychic process from the purely sensual. And this cannot remain without influence on the psychic process itself. Directed thinking becomes absolutely impossible when the sensual has too high a threshold value. Because its value is too high, it constantly intrudes into the psyche where it disrupts and destroys the function of directed thinking, which is based on the exclusion of everything incompatible with thought. From this elementary consideration follows the practical importance of rites and dogmas that prove their value not only from this point of view, but from a purely opportunistic and biological one, not to speak of the immediate, specifically religious effects accruing to individuals from a belief in this dogma. Highly as we esteem Scotus Erigena, the less it is permitted to despise the achievement of Radbertus. For what we may learn from this example is that the thinking of the introvert is incommensurable with the thinking of the extrovert, since the two forms of thinking, as regards their determinants, are wholly and fundamentally different. We might perhaps say that the thinking of the introvert is rational, while that of the extrovert is programmatic. I feel that this is one of the more challenging sections that we've explored together. So I want to know exactly what Jung means by programmatic versus rational. Because I don't think he's using the term in a way that we necessarily would talk about these days. Maybe according to a particular program or method, and so that sort of emphasizes the externalized, extroverted, objective component, I think. So that's very interesting, right? Let's read back a little bit because I don't understand what he's saying about how we shouldn't throw aside what Robertus was saying because the dogma accomplished something and our age owes something to those accomplishments. So belief in the reality of the miracle, the fact that people could believe that this was literally, materially happening because it's a miracle, it allows some sort of detachment of the psyche from the purely sensual. By making it a miracle, we are not as connected to the sensory and therefore are more able to abstractly think about it. And so it's really interesting, but I don't know. That's the best I can do. I think I might actually be missing something in this section. So yeah, if you have any insights as an outsider, please feel free to share. These arguments I wish particularly to emphasize do not pretend to have said anything decisive about the individual psychology of our two protagonists. We do not know of Scotus Erigena personally. It is little enough. What we know of Scotus Erigena personally, it is little enough, is not sufficient for us to make a sure diagnosis of his type. What we do know speaks in favor of the introverted type Of Robertus, we know next to nothing. We know only that he said something that contradicted ordinary human thinking, but with surer logic of feeling, surmised what his age was prepared to accept as suitable. This would speak in favor of the extroverted type, because he's paying attention to what's going to fit with the zeitgeist or the spirit of the times. But then, if we're talking about ordinary human thinking, that doesn't sound especially introverted either, does it? It sounds like it's adhering to some sort of common standards of what is a logical procession of thoughts. I don't know. For insufficient knowledge, we must suspend judgment on both personalities, since particularly in the case of Robertus, the matter might well be decided differently. He might equally well have been an introvert, but with limited reasoning powers that in no way rose above the conception of his milieu, and with a logic so lacking in originality that it was just sufficient to draw the obvious conclusions from the premises already laid down in the writings of the Church Fathers. So it's not really an easy matter at times to determine if we're seeing this introverted or more extroverted process. Conversely, Scotus Erigena might as well have been an extrovert if it could be shown that he lived in a milieu that was distinguished in any case by common sense and that considered a corresponding assertion suitable and desirable. But this has in no sense been demonstrated. On the other hand, we do know how great was the yearning of that age for the reality of religious miracles. To an age so constituted, the views of Scotus Erigena must have seemed cold and deadening, whereas the assertion of Robertus must have been felt as life-promoting, since it concretized what everyone desired. Whoa. All right, we'll accept it. So yeah, this was just about transubstantiation and a few different ways of conceptualizing that process. Is it something that is literally, materialistically happening, and this food is actually becoming, in some sense, the body of Jesus? Well, Robertus seemed to think so, and that is what people wanted to believe. They really wanted this symbolic thing to be more than that, to be a material, actualized process. And there are other ways of interpreting it, however, as we've talked about. Sorry, I'm losing steam, but yeah, I think that's about it. Once again, I think I could use some help understanding this bit about how the doctrine of transubstantiation created room for directed thinking. Yeah, I don't know. In any case, yeah, thank you for tuning in, and I will see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.